And then he says the doctrine of baptisms. The doctrine of baptisms, according to the Bible, is a basic doctrine. What is that doctrine? Look, it's not hard, folks. You're dunked underwater, for crying out loud.
Hello, Jeff Dollar here. I'd like to continue our study on the issue of baptism, the mode of baptism. My introductory video, which I challenged the other preachers in the new IFB and IFB, those who make a mockery of those who would sprinkle, use sprinkling or pouring for baptism, I waited a few days to see if anybody would take me up on the challenge. And seeing that they have not done so, we're just going to go through and go over a couple of these things as to why a pastor or even a church or denomination would hold to the concept of sprinkling, or to allow that as an option, as whether it might be immersion or sprinkling or pouring, as our church would hold to. Why would a church do that? Why, in some of what appears to be in the scripture, something obvious? That baptism is immersion. It's dunking, as Stephen Anderson points out. That's what the word means. Well, I'd like to look into that. It's going to take a couple of videos because I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on each one. Remember, the purpose of this is not to convert you into not being an immersionist anymore, if you believe in baptism by immersion only, but it's to show that there is a valid argument here. Whenever a person gets up, like Stephen Anderson or some of these other guys, and they make a mockery of those who would hold to a different position on baptism, they think they're doing it because we're stupid or because we don't love the Lord, or for whatever reason, we haven't studied the issue. But actually the opposite is true. I came to my way of thinking on baptism through much study and much difficulty. I had to come to a point. I was a pastor in a church which didn't hold to immersion only, and they told me, well, if you want to stay, you're going to need to believe the way we do. I'm a fundamental Baptist. I couldn't do that, so I was just prepared to leave. But the pastor told me, here, I want you to study these things, look them over. Because I couldn't get ordained in a Methodist church if I would not sprinkle. In my mode of baptism, if I would refuse to do that. So I took up the challenge. He gave me several booklets. He said, here, read these. And he gave me some booklets by immersionists. He said, read this. You come to your own conclusion. That was something new to me as a Hyles-ite. That's just something you don't do. Well, I was forced into doing that, and I came to the conclusion that sprinkling is a legitimate form of baptism. Now, and there's a reason for that, and I want to go through the scriptures to look at as to the possibilities as to why that it's not always immersion only. One of the arguments that I had to deal with was the fact of the word baptizo, that it always means immersion. That's the definition of the word. It means to dip or to dye. You're dunking in the water. That's the literal definition of the Greek word. So then, if that's the case, then what's the argument? Well, there is an argument, but let's see how it's presented in fundamentalism. John R. Rice, in his book, was on baptism. He says, if baptism is immersion, then why doesn't the Bible plainly say immerse? It does. The word baptize means exactly that. And then M.R. DeHaan, he was the founder, I believe, of the Daily Bread, and there's a radio Bible class as well. This goes way back. He had in a booklet that he wrote on baptism, the Greek word bapto and all its variations has only one meaning, and that is to dip in or to immerse. The word never means to pour on or to sprinkle. It means to put under in every case. He's very emphatic in that. He has words in capital. So you have these two prominent Baptists believing that this word always and only means immersion. However, John R. Church is a lesser known person in Baptist circles. I believe he was a Methodist. He had this to say. This is in his book, Why Baptize by Sprinkling. We are not so much concerned about how that is the word baptizo, is defined in some Greek lexicon, as we are about what it means to Jesus and the people that he taught in his days of his flesh. Resorting to Greek lexicons can never fully settle the question as to what the word means in the New Testament. The best way to find out what it meant to the people in the days of Christ is to go back to the New Testament and see how it is used there. remember, you have a primarily Jewish audience here that spoke Greek, but they had to borrow words from the Greek language to define Hebrew concepts. So they used the word baptizo to define the cleansing of someone with water. That's why you have John the Baptist. We'll get into some of that a little bit later in a future video. But they would borrow Greek words and adapt them the best they could to Hebrew concepts. And to find that, let's take a look to Mark chapter 7 and verse 4. Actually start at verse 3. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Actually, in the King James, I believe it says tables. This is the New King James. So we have here that these Pharisees, they held a tradition that whenever they went out in the marketplace, they believed that they became corrupted by those around them, all the sin, and if they touched anything that they shouldn't have touched, they needed to be cleansed. So it says here that they would wash them, the vessels, all the vessels that they had, the cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and then it says tables or couches, and literally it's I think the word is klino, which from where we get the word recline. The table is a Western concept. We're looking back in ancient Israel. They didn't use tables as I'm sitting here at a table right now. They would recline when they ate. So a couch that they reclined on was what we're talking about here. Now it says here that they wash. The word wash is the word, a derivative of the word baptizo. Now, if they are washing, they're baptizing, we can see baptizing their cups, pitchers, and copper vessels. We do that all the time when we do the dishes. But to baptize a couch by immersion, a couch, we'll give it the benefit of the doubt, a table. Then what are we talking about? Well, no, we're not talking about literal immersion here. We're talking about a washing, a ceremonial cleansing. And we know that because Numbers chapter 19 and verse 18. This is where the Pharisees got this practice. A clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water, sprinkle it on the tent, on all the vessels, on the persons who were there, or on the one who touched a bone, the slain, the dead, or a grave. So we have here this word baptizo in the New Testament is used to describe this Old Testament practice of taking hyssop and ceremonially washing or cleansing, sprinkling these items in a ceremonial way. They didn't dip the items here, they sprinkled them. So the word baptizo does not mean immerse, it means to that's a hard word for me, ceremonially cleanse. So we have the word not being used here to dip in the water, but to sprinkle. Hebrews chapter 6 is another one. Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priest, this is verse 6, Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 6. Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priest always went in the first part of the tabernacle performing the services. Then down to verse 9. So we're talking about the priests and what happened there. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. Concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, there's the word baptizo again, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. So what are we talking about here? What was going on in this Old Testament practice with the priests with these washings and fleshly ordinances? Well, we have a washing in Exodus chapter 29 and verse 4. And Aaron and his sons you shall bring to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and you shall wash them with water. So here we have an Old Testament washing described in Hebrews chapter 9, and it's described here in the book of Exodus chapter 29 as Aaron and his sons standing and water applied to them and them being washed. They weren't dipped, they weren't dunked, they were washed. And this was a ceremonial washing. And the word is baptizo, so it does not mean immerse here. So finally, Luke chapter 11. And in light of all of that, look to Luke chapter 11, verse 37 and 38. And as he spoke, that is Jesus, A certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and sat down to eat. When the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he had not first washed before dinner. So what do we have here? Well, this washing, again, is the word baptism, the word baptizo. The Pharisee, why didn't you immerse yourself, Jesus, before you came to dinner? If the word itself always and only can mean immerse, that's what Jesus would have had to do there. Did he expect Jesus to go and baptize himself before he ate? Obviously not. Now you go back to the other practices which we saw in Mark 7, and it gives us a description of that. It was the ceremonial washing, sprinkling with hyssop within water to cleanse in a ceremonial fashion. It does not mean immerse only. So what we see here is this concept of the word itself. And we're going to get into more of this as we go on in future videos, going down into the water, coming up out of the water, and Paul's baptism, the Philippian jailer's baptism, some other things we'll look into, some of the things which are overlooked perhaps in the Baptist circles. But the idea here is that argument has no validity whatsoever. If someone ever says the word itself always means dunk, sorry, they didn't get that from the scriptures. One final thought. I mentioned that the church I was once associated with as an assistant pastor was a Methodist church. It was a fundamentalist church through and through. Our pastor was associated and knew personally Bob Jones Jr., I think it was Jr., and Bob Jones III. He was more down the line of Bob Jones than what he was Hyles, but he did appreciate Hyles' evangelism, and that's why I was on staff. He would have Baptists come in and preach for him. We would have week or 2 week long tent meetings. We'd set up a big tent. This is a rural area, so we had a lot of space. We set up a big tent in the field, and we would advertise this. People would come in. We'd have people preach, and we would have Baptists come in and preach. Baptist singers would come in and sing. And so we'd had this one group in particular. They were associated with Bob Jones. They came from Bob Jones. It was a team, an evangelistic team. They were Baptists, and they were here for many different tent revivals. Well, it was understood that when you went into a Methodist church, you did not bring up the topic of baptism and make that an issue and cause contention. And they, for the most part, they followed that. But one year they began to preach on why you should be baptized by immersion, and they were doing this in a Methodist church. They were confronted by our pastor. And he asked them these very things here, and this is part of the argument. This is not the entire argument, but this idea of baptizo and the word itself, and this was among some other things. And he asked them, "Now, can you answer me these things?" One guy looked at the other and said, "How would you answer?" They didn't have an answer for it. They had been taught that the fallacy that baptizo always means immerse, and so they weren't asked to come back. After the pastor died, I was still on staff and bringing them back in to preach. And I said, no. I said, our pastor told me he would not have them back because they violated this principle and were causing division within our church. There will be more to come. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section. If you want to contact me, would like a copy of this little booklet I put together about 30 years ago on the topic, you're welcome to do so. And may the Lord bless you in your search for truth. People were talking about